Chapter 39, Section 2, Richard Nixon's Rise to the Presidency. Born in California in 1913, Richard Nixon was one of 5 brothers. He worked to pay his way through college and law school. After serving in the Navy during World War II, he was elected to the House of Representatives and later to the Senate. From 1953 to 1960, he served as vice president to Dwight Eisenhower. In 1960, Nixon ran for president. He lost to John F. Kennedy in a very close election. 2 years later, he ran for governor of California and lost the race as well. In his concession speech, Nixon announced his retirement from politics. "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore," he told reporters. In reality, however, Nixon's political career was far from over. A bumpy road to the White House. In 1968, Nixon made a spectacular political comeback by winning the Republican nomination for president. In what had been a troubled election year, the choice of Nixon as a candidate was one of many surprises and shocks. First, President Lyndon Johnson had unexpectedly decided not to run for re-election. Soon thereafter had followed the stunning assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. To add to the surprise, Alabama Governor George Wallace mounted a strong campaign for president on the American Independent Party ticket. During civil rights struggles in his state, Wallace had been an ardent segregationist. His resistance to integration won him support from white voters in the South. Wallace also appealed to the average man on the street by attacking the liberals, intellectuals, and longhairs who have run the country for too long. A final shock to the nation came with the outbreak of violence in Chicago, Illinois during the Democratic National Convention. Outside the convention, protesters opposed the Vietnam War clash with police, while inside, Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination on a pro-war platform. The Democratic Party left the convention anything but united. These troubling events left many Americans fearful that the country was falling apart. Recognizing this concern, Nixon made it central to his campaign. As he put it, "We live in a deeply troubled and profoundly unsettled time. Drugs, crime, campus revolts, racial discord, draft resistance, on every hand, we find old standards violated, old values discarded." In his campaign, he depicted himself as the champion of the many ordinary people who worked hard, paid their taxes, and loved their country. Nixon appealed to their desire for stability by promising a renewed commitment to law and order. To win votes in what had been the solidly Democratic South, Nixon implemented a Southern strategy. For a running mate, he chose a Southern governor, Spiro T. Agnew of Maryland. Agnew was known for his tough stand against racial violence and urban crime. Nixon also reached out to conservative Southern voters with talk of respect for states' rights and smaller federal government, which were traditionally valued by Southern Democrats. The election proved to be very close. Nixon won with just 43.4% of the popular vote. In 5 Southern states, Wallace won a plurality of votes, not a majority, but more than any other candidate. Democrats also maintained control of Congress. Because Nixon lacked both a strong electoral mandate and a Republican majority in Congress, it was not clear whether he would be able to lead the country the way he wanted. Nixon's domestic policies, a conservative and liberal blend. Having won the presidency by a narrow margin, Nixon tried to appeal to conservatives and liberals once in office. He reached out to conservatives with a plan called New Federalism to reduce the size and power of the federal government. After a third of a century of power flowing from the people and the states to Washington, Nixon explained, it was time for a new federalism in which power, funds, and responsibility will flow from Washington to the people. The centerpiece of Nixon's new federalism was a proposal called revenue sharing. Under revenue sharing, the federal government distributed tax revenues to states and local governments to spend as they saw fit. State and local leaders liked the practice because it gave them more funds as well as the power to spend those funds where most needed. Revenue sharing proved to be popular with conservatives. However, Nixon was less successful at shrinking the federal government. He did do away with some of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society bureaucracy, including the Office of Economic Opportunity. At the same time, though, Nixon expanded several other social benefit programs. He increased Social Security and enlarged the food stamp program. Nixon went on to increase the size and power of government by signing new federal agencies into existence. One was the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the OSHA. He charged OSHA with protecting workers on the job. He also established the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in order to protect human health and to safeguard the natural environment. Nixon's most surprising initiative was the Family Assistance Plan. Under this proposed plan, the government would support every poor family with a minimum annual income. To get this support, family members able to work would be required to seek employment. The Family Assistance Plan would have greatly expanded the number of families eligible for public assistance. Nixon thought this program would appeal to liberals. He also hoped the increased responsibility for running welfare programs that it gave the states would interest conservatives. Instead, conservatives attacked the plan as a reward for laziness. Liberals denounced its proposed guaranteed income as too little to live on. After much debate, Congress rejected the plan. A mixed record on civil rights. Nixon's civil rights policies were as mixed as the rest of his domestic agenda. In pursuit of his Southern strategy, he sought to appoint conservative Southern judges to the Supreme Court. His first two choices had records of supporting segregation. The Senate rejected them both. Nixon also called for changes to the Voting Rights Act when it came up for renewal in 1970. Congress rejected his proposals, which would have reduced federal oversight of voting officials in the South. Nonetheless, he re-signed the Voting Rights Act into law. At the same time, Nixon sought to increase economic opportunities for African Americans by expanding affirmative action. Under the Philadelphia Plan, he required construction companies working on federally funded projects to hire specific numbers of minority workers. He also encouraged black capitalism by providing federal assistance to black-owned businesses. Struggling with a stagnant economy. Throughout his presidency, Nixon struggled with the nation's economic problems. In 1970, the United States entered a recession. Normally, during a recession, unemployment rises, wages drop, and consumers spend less money. To encourage people to buy goods, companies lower their prices. As prices drop, people start spending again. Then business activity picks up, and eventually the recession ends. However, this is not what happened in the early 1970s. Instead, the nation experienced an economic condition known as stagflation. Unemployment rose just as it would in a normal recession, but prices also increased at an alarming rate. Americans found themselves living with both a stagnant economy and rapid inflation. Nixon responded to stagflation in two ways. First, he attacked inflation with a three-phase program. In Phase 1, he froze wages and prices for 90 days. In Phase 2, he authorized a new federal agency to strictly limit future wage and price increases. He then turned to unemployment. He increased government spending to put more money into the economy. As a result, joblessness fell. Nixon then moved on to Phase 3 of his inflation plan, replacing strict wage and price controls with voluntary guidelines. Unfortunately, with controls lifted, the nation suffered its most rapid rise in cost of living since World War II's end. To make matters even worse, in the fall of 1973, oil-exporting nations in the Middle East stopped shipping oil to the United States. They established this oil embargo to protest U.S. support for Israel in conflicts between Israel and Arab nations. The result was a nationwide energy crisis. To conserve dwindling supplies, the government urged homeowners to lower their thermostats. It also reduced highway speed limits to 55 miles per hour. The crisis did not ease until the Middle Eastern nations lifted the ban the following year.